Hello and welcome to Sustainability Marketing Lecture 4 on Sustainability Consumer Behaviour. This is episode 2, looking at sustainable consumption in context. In the previous episode, we looked to understand sustainable consumption, and in this episode, we'll be looking at sustainable consumption in particular contexts. And then in episode 3, we'll be having an interview to pick up on some of the issues raised in these first 2 episodes. In terms of the learning outcomes for this episode, the first will be to understand the role that context plays in determining our sustainability behaviour as consumers, and the second outcome will be to appreciate the differences in sustainability impacts of particular lifestyles that typical consumers might have in different countries and what that might mean for sustainability and for marketing. For the structure of this episode, to begin with, we'll look at purchases as a notion of context. We'll look at lifestyles and households as a context for sustainable behaviours. And finally, we'll do some international context and comparisons by looking at the Green Dex survey. We said in the previous episode that very often the question that has driven sustainability marketing and notions of green marketing back in the 1980s and 1990s is the question, who is the green consumer, who is the sustainable consumer, with the notion that we can identify types of people who are very sort of consistent and motivated in their sustainable consumption behaviours. In many ways, however, though, that is the wrong question. We've been tending to tackle the wrong question, I think, in much of the work in the past. It was William Kardash, a very sort of prescient marketing author back in 1976, who pointed out that actually we're all green consumers in the sense that if we were offered 2 choices which were identical, except that one was better in its sustainability performance than another, well, most of us would really choose the more sustainable option if there were no other compromises available. There may be a few consumers who would just consume unsustainably just to be different, but if all other things were equal, we would all tend to make sustainability choices in our consumption behaviour. So what that suggests to us is that it's not really the consumer that's necessarily the key to understanding consumer behaviour. It's understanding individual purchases as a context for that behaviour, and that it's individual contexts, individual purchases, I should say, that will tend to determine whether or not consumers do follow through on their sustainability concerns to reflect it in their consumer behaviour. And we can demonstrate this through the Sustainable Purchase Perception Matrix that you'll see on the slide behind me. If we go all the way across the different studies that have been conducted on consumers and why they do and sometimes don't choose particular products and services that are more sustainable in their nature, there are 2 sets of factors that tend to be most consistently proven to be significant in these studies. The first is the notion of costs and benefits. So the idea that consumers basically do behave quite rationally. They weigh up the costs, and they might be financial costs, but they might also be costs in terms of effort and time and psychological costs, the sort of thing that Frank will be exploring in the chapter and the lecture on sustainability costs. So to a large extent, consumers are looking for a rational, cost-beneficial solution to their problems when they're looking to buy products or use particular products. So really what they're looking for is a low degree of compromise. They may be willing to pay a little extra or make a little extra effort or to do something a little bit different or invest a little bit more time, but really the amount of compromise they perceive as being involved in a particular purchase will tend to determine whether or not they do act on their sustainability concerns. Then the other set of factors which are particularly significant across a range of studies are notions of consumer effectiveness. So where a consumer believes in what they're doing, they believe that the issues they're addressing are important, they believe that the solutions they're being offered are significant and worthwhile solutions, and also that they believe that them buying a particular product will make a difference. So it gives us our 2 dimensions for our matrix, excuse me, with the notion that really the chances of success in a market with a sustainability solution will be those that are in perhaps the win-win box on our model, where the degree of confidence that the sustainability marketer has inspired for the consumer is quite high, that the consumer believes it's a real issue, that the company is offering a real solution, and that by buying that product, the customer will make a real difference. and yet the degree of compromise is potentially low. So they're not having to pay a great deal more, they're not having to make a great deal more effort, and they're just able to get a good degree of benefit in a sort of cost-benefit type analysis. So a range of very successful products, I think, have tended to operate on the win-win quadrant of the model, particularly, for example, low-energy products, where you maybe have a product delivering exactly the same benefits. So a fridge freezer, for example, that's a low-energy model, really isn't particularly a compromise for the consumer. It won't particularly cost more. It'll be more economical to run in the long term. It's as easy to buy as an inefficient model. And so really it's a very win-win purchase. It's very easy for the consumer to be motivated to make a purchase in that sector of the model. We also have sectors where perhaps the customer is convinced about the benefits, but are having to make more of a compromise. So what we think of as feel-good purchases. And I think if you think of a retailer like Body Shop, when Body Shop first came onto the market, it was typically asking consumers to pay a considerable premium for the products that they offered compared to the more conventional alternatives. But I think Anita Roddick was very good at generating a strong sense of confidence amongst consumers that the products were better than conventional offerings and that the company was very dedicated and sincere in its efforts. And that the issues that the company raised, from animal rights through to pollution, through to the treatment of people in developing countries, were all important issues, and that in some ways joining in with the Body Shop's agenda and purchasing their products really would make a difference and would tend to make the consumer feel good in doing so. You also have some purchases that are really, they're low on effort in terms of for the customer. There's not a great compromise involved, and yet the degree of confidence that it'll make a real difference to the world is relatively low as well. So using recycled paper products, for example, consumers might feel it's very easy, there's no great compromise, but they might not feel it's necessarily going to make a huge difference to the planet, but why not make such purchases? And then finally you have the ones that are under the why bother quadrant, which is products where you're really asking the consumer to make a significant effort. So you're asking them to pay a great deal more, or you're asking them to put in more effort to either purchasing or using the product or maintaining the product. And maybe you haven't really convinced them of the benefits of adopting the product from a sustainability point of view. And it's interesting to think about cars from this point of view. There are a number of sustainable car models in the past that have really struggled to gain market share. And I think it's because they operated in the why bother section. When we're talking about electric vehicles, for example, they've required consumers to make more effort in terms of recharging the vehicle, for example, and without really convincing the customer that there are benefits from a sustainability point of view in terms of a car. People tend to think of a car as an environmentally damaging product, and maybe a greener car is not making that much of a difference. So I think for many companies, the trick really has been to try and move a particular consumption element and a particular purchase context into those kind of win-win, or at least why not, or feel-good sectors. And it's interesting, the campaign that's been recently launched by Nissan for its Leaf electric vehicle, you can see is very much about trying to reposition the notion of an electric car away from that why bother purchase up to the win-win. It's a marketing communications campaign very much highlighting the convenience and the cost effectiveness of running an electric car like a Nissan Leaf. I think we can look at particular types of purchase as well as a context and say that, again, as consumers, we might behave quite differently depending on the nature of the product we're thinking of buying. So things like the value of a product. If we're buying a house for a great deal of money, we maybe think very carefully about exactly what we're going to buy, and in terms of whether or not we go for a more sustainable solution might become a very significant issue within such a purchase, compared to maybe when we're going into a shop and just buying a pint of milk. We might not tend to take quite the same time and trouble over the purchase. In terms of the visibility of the purchase, it's interesting that coffee has been such a successful product in the fair trade market, maybe compared to others like sugar and dried fruit and other ingredients. And partly it may be because socially, coffee is very visible within the home. It's something that you offer to guests when they come to visit, and so it's a socially more significant product than many of the other types of commodities that could also be purchased on a fair trade basis. Also the reason why you're buying something. If you're buying something as a gift for somebody else, or you're buying something as a treat or an indulgence for yourself, again, you might feel differently about choosing a sustainable option compared to if you're just buying an everyday staple. And then finally, in terms of where you are when you make a purchase can make a difference. There's considerable research showing that consumers, even those who are very concerned about sustainability issues and relatively consistent sustainable consumers within their own homes, maybe behave quite differently when they're on holiday. They don't make the sustainable choices. They don't worry so much about recycling or responsible disposal. But when we're on holiday, we maybe allow our sustainable credentials to go on holiday as well as consumers. So it's not just about understanding the consumer as a person who follows through on their sustainability concerns to one degree or other very consistently. It's about understanding that even individual consumers will tend to vary quite considerably in their behaviour across different purchase contexts. So as marketers, what we need to understand is, how the consumer relates to the type of purchase we're asking them to make, not just simply thinking, can we identify the green consumer and can we market effectively to them? As I mentioned before in the previous episode, that we've tended to think of the consumer as an individual, and most of the marketing textbooks treat consumers as a single person. And yet the reality is that most of us live within households and within families or sharing with other people. And so it's not simply a question of understanding an individual and their wants and needs and how they live. It's a question really of understanding lifestyles and homes and a whole range of different consumption behaviours. And as I mentioned in the last episode, the home and how it's managed, how food is consumed within it, the energy use within it, and also how people travel to and from the home to places of work or leisure make up the majority of our impact as consumers. And what we're beginning to appreciate is this notion of not thinking about consumers in terms of individual consumers or even individual purchase decisions, but really the notion of an overall consumer lifestyle and how we live, and the notion of sustainability lifestyles emerging as something that is a framework within which particular purchases, particular elements of consumption behaviour take place. And of particular interest is the notion of sustainability-orientated lifestyles. And the particular movement that has gathered quite a lot of attention in recent years is the notion of lifestyles of health and sustainability, or LOHAS markets as they're sometimes called. They emerged in about 1999, the notion of LOHAS markets and LOHAS consumers, which is this idea of a very consistent lifestyle oriented towards healthy purchases, more sustainable purchases, and more sustainable and healthy ways of living one's life. And it's really grown to become quite a significant market. Recent figures put the number of consumers who, to some extent, have adopted the LOHAS principles within their lifestyle. In America, for example, is estimated around 20%. And that represents a $290 billion market into which sustainability-orientated companies have a really good chance of making an impact in terms of interesting those consumers in their products and services. LOHAS consumers also tend to have particular characteristics. They tend to be very engaged consumers. They're very interested not just in the issues of sustainability, but also in the products and goods and services that they buy. So they tend to be very interested in the ingredients in products. They're very interested in the stories behind the products. They're very interested in knowing about the companies that provide the goods and services that they consume. So they're very engaged. They tend to be very vigilant. They're very careful about checking details and facts, and they want to really know the details about the brands and products that they buy. They're also quite influential. They tend to be the type of consumers who talk to other consumers and who can have an influence person to person on their friends, their neighbours, other members of the community. And there are various phrases that tend to get used for these types of influential consumers, like brand evangelist, for example. But if a LOHAS consumer adopts and likes your brand, they will typically help to promote it on to other people. As consumers, they tend to be quite holistic in their view. LOHAS consumers tend to have quite an understanding of the interconnection of their lives with others, of our lives with the sustainability agenda. So they tend to have quite a sophisticated and interconnected understanding of the world we live in and how their lifestyle relates to it. And finally, they're very active online. They're far more likely to use the internet to research products, for example, than the mass of consumers. And they tend to be much more prone to, for example, posting information and feedback on products and to joining in with online conversations about particular products and companies and services. We're seeing a whole range of publications, for example, coming out showing people how to live more sustainable lives with this idea of promoting the low-has consumer lifestyle. So there are two examples there, the Green Living Handbook and urban homesteading, the idea of becoming more self-sufficient within your own home, growing your own food, making or repairing your own clothes and such like. And so this really is becoming a sustainable living movement. It's not simply about people as consumers, it's much more about lifestyles and understanding people's lives in the round. And you can even, not just live the lifestyle, you can play the online game. America Public Media have launched an interactive online game called Consumer Consequences, and it allows you to put in all sorts of details about your life and find out the extent to which you're living a relatively sustainable life as a consumer. So we're starting to see this idea of the sustainable consumer, the sustainable lifestyle, as a framework for sustainable consumption behaviour really starting to take root. The ultimate extension of it, perhaps the most extreme example of low-has lifestyles, is this notion of voluntary simplicity. And there are many communities, ones like Findhorn, for example, in Scotland, that have been in existence for many years and really have invited people in there to live based on a notion of voluntary simplicity, living a relatively simple life. And there are 5 key principles behind the voluntary simplicity lifestyle. Perhaps the most obvious one is material simplicity. So it's the idea of a less consumption intensive lifestyle where we're looking for efficient and durable products. So perhaps when we want a product, why not buy one that will last a lifetime? It may be more expensive, but ultimately it has a lower impact on the environment. This notion of human scale, moving away from perhaps global production and consumption system towards something much more local, much simpler. So to try and think of things on a much more sort of human and community scale, for example. There's a notion within voluntary simplicity really of taking control of your life, of self-determination, of being less reliant perhaps on global companies and global production and consumption networks to meet our need, being less dependent on government, for example, to meet our needs. The ideas of individuals, households, communities becoming more able to, for example, grow their own food or generate their own energy, or other ways to become much more self-reliant and self-determining in how we live our lives. Ecological awareness, clearly one of the driving factors behind voluntary simplicity is concern about the environment, concern about sustainability issues. And so typically they tend to lead a relatively resource conserving lifestyle, so looking to avoid waste, looking to recycle and reuse products as much as possible, really to save environmental resources. And then finally, it's also about an emphasis on less material elements of life, about thinking about personal growth, about trying to gain satisfaction in life, less through consuming material goods, but more perhaps through things like experiences, things like developing your own skills, maximizing your own potential, doing things that provide enjoyment in ways that give you satisfaction other than those commercially provided consumption experiences which are seen to drive the economy. And this can be wrapped up very much, this move towards this voluntary simplicity lifestyle, in the notion of downshifting, which is becoming an increasingly common phenomenon of people perhaps opting out of a high-pressure job that pays a great deal, that generates disposable income, that is used to consume lots of goods and services, really to make up for the fact that you're so pressurized with your working lifestyle. And the idea of stepping back, maybe taking a job that is less hard work, it pays less, allows you to consume less, but maybe gives you more time for the things in life that we know from the research give us actual satisfaction. That things like time spent with friends and relatives, developing skills and experiences that we enjoy, those tend to be the true sources of satisfaction for many people, not the material consumption that we tend to engage on when we're really stuck on this what's called the hedonic treadmill. That we work to consume, and then we have to work, to spend, to consume, and it's a sort of treadmill of ever-increasing sort of pressure and consumption and earning and working, And people are increasingly choosing to step off that treadmill and to find a downshifted lifestyle that is perhaps less consumption intensive. Another important context, as I mentioned earlier on, is the notion of household, that we tend to live within homes. And it's not just who we are or how we live, it's also who we live with, and how many people we live with tend to impact our environmental, the environmental consequences of our lifestyle. So, and this graph behind me shows the energy and the climate change emissions linked to different types of household. And what's interesting is, proportionately, the more people that live together, the more the households per person reduces. So if you look on the far left of the diagram, for example, a single pensioner living alone, when we compare that to two pensioners living together, well, the two pensioners living together only has about 50% more climate change emissions than those who live on their own. And that's very significant because in the majority of developed countries, what we are seeing is a trend towards increasing numbers of single-person households. That elderly people are tending to live on their own more often, not as part of extended families. Marriage breakups are tending to lead to more adults living lives in individual flats or houses. So we're seeing a trend for us to live individually and to live apart, and that has both environmental and social consequences. It has environmental consequences because, particularly from an energy use perspective, living individually is a much less efficient way of living. It also has social consequences because it leads to more sense of social isolation and depression. So I think in terms of our quality of life, our environmental impact, how we live, the household we live in, who we live in, has a considerable impact on our lives and quality of life as consumers. And if we're looking ahead in terms of, for example, developing policies to create more sustainable societies, much of it will be things like, can we tackle notions of housing provision and providing strategies to encourage people to live together in ways that are beneficial for them socially as well as efficient environmentally. The final context I want to talk about is an international context, and we've tried to frame the book from a global perspective. And what's interesting to think about is sustainable consumption and what counts as sustainable consumption behaviour will tend to vary across different countries within the world, and the consumption priorities might well differ according to culture, climate and infrastructure within particular countries. There's some very interesting work that's been done over the last 4 years by National Geographic together with the consultancy GlobeScan, comparing consumer lifestyles across 17 countries using a whole wide range of different elements of consumer behaviour and consumer lifestyle. They come under the broad issues of housing, transport, food and the purchase of goods. So the types of areas we know the major environmental impacts are linked to. And both everyday consumption and occasional big ticket items, so consumer durables that are bought occasionally, as well as everyday groceries and items like that. And it's quite interesting for them to compare the average consumers. And so, of course, in some element, we know that environmental impact is linked to wealth and degree of disposable income. But to a large extent, this survey tries to even that out by focusing on relatively comparable middle-class consumers, what we might think of as the typical consumer who we might want to interest as getting involved in sustainable consumption behaviours. And from those 17 countries, you can see depths of sustainable consumption in different areas. And what's interesting is it's not necessarily the countries you might associate with sustainable consumer behaviour. Often, a great deal of the history of marketing and sustainability has tended to focus on countries like USA, Canada, Germany, the UK, the Nordic countries. And yet actually, in many cases, if we take that wide range of different elements of sustainable consumption and compare a typical consumer across the world, it's not those countries that have the greenest consumers. It's actually countries like Brazil, China and India that are having the most sustainable consumer lifestyles within them. So it's not necessarily the results you might expect. What's also, I think, particularly interesting is this finding from the most recent Green Dex survey. And it's a correlation between consumers' sense of guilt and the degree of sustainability of their lifestyle. And I think the really remarkable thing is the degree to which there is a strong correlation. And this rather goes against much of the accepted wisdom within the sustainability marketing literature and amongst much of the public policy sort of studies in terms of promoting more sustainable lifestyles, that we shouldn't make people feel bad or feel guilty about their consumer lifestyle, that we want to give them positive messages about their lifestyles and about how they can become more sustainable. I think it's very interesting to look at that model and see that those consumers who have the best scores in terms of the sustainability of their lifestyle in India, China, Brazil, South Korea, also have the strongest sense that their lifestyles have consequences in terms of social and ecological impacts and actually have the greatest sense of guilt. Whereas the consumers in the mature economies, the Americans, the Canadians, in Japan, Britain, for example, they have much less of a sense of guilt about the consequences of their consumption. And I think that's a very interesting set of findings, and I think you can really explore for yourself perhaps reasons why that is. Why do we feel less guilty in developed nations about our consumption? Do we just simply feel that consumption is a right? Are we simply too used to high levels of consumption to worry about it? We just simply accept it as normal. I think it's a very interesting concept, and one of the things that is emerging recently from some marketing studies is that there is a growing sense within consumers of a sense of responsibility for things like climate change and tackling climate change. And the notion amongst consumers that they do have some responsibility, along with companies, along with governments, to tackle this really is an idea that's growing in strength, although it's quite contrary to the common marketing notion of the consumer. In the marketing textbooks, we tend to accept the customer is king, that there's consumer sovereignty, the consumer has rights, but the consumer doesn't necessarily have responsibilities. What the research data is showing us is that increasingly consumers do feel a sense of responsibility, albeit a shared one, and that may be a very important lever, really, with which to help to move consumers towards more sustainable choices, towards more sustainable purchasing, and towards more sustainable lifestyles. So in terms of the issues we've raised in this episode, we've talked about household structure, and you might like to think about if household structure is important for our environmental impacts as consumers, what that might be for the implications for marketers and for policymakers. Also thinking about perhaps what factors could make a lifestyle of voluntary simplicity difficult for a particular individual to adopt. So what obstacles might there be to living simpler lives as consumers? And finally, you might find it interesting to calculate your own GreenDex score. The National Geographic website provides the GreenDex calculator, so you can put in aspects of your own lifestyle and find out where you score globally as a sustainable consumer. And you might like to think from there about what changes you could make to improve your particular score. In terms of references, Chapter 4 in our book, Sustainability Marketing, contains a great deal of further information on the topics raised in this session. I'd also recommend the article by McDonald's and Oates on sustainability and consumer perceptions and marketing strategies, which again looks across a wide range of sustainable consumer elements of behaviour and the sort of contexts that shape them. And finally, I would recommend the National Geographic GreenDex survey that's available online to both look at the results and look at some of the science behind it. So thank you very much for listening, and bye.